The dress had cost me 4 months of a major's salary, and I was standing in front of a mirror in Charleston when my mother called to tell me my wedding didn't matter as much as my sister's housewarming party. That's the sentence that broke something in me that 13 years of deployments never touched. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did. I stood there in white silk with pins still in the hemphone pressed to my ear, waiting for her to say she was joking. She never did. What happened next is the reason my family spent this Thanksgiving alone. My name is Ruby Henderson. I'm 32 years old, a major in the United States Army, and until that phone call, I thought I understood exactly where I stood in my family. I was wrong, and it took a wedding dress fitting to prove it. I remember the sound in the boutique that afternoon, steamers hissing, the seamstress humming something under her breath, my best friend Dana scrolling through seating charts on her phone in the chair behind me. Everything about that day was supposed to be small and golden, 6 weeks out from the wedding. Venue locked in since last spring. The little stone chapel outside Savannah my grandmother used to take me to as a kid. Guest list finalized. My unit had already started requesting leave. Sergeant Alvarez flying in from a training rotation in Germany, my old roommate from West Point coming straight from Seoul. People had rearranged their lives around one Saturday in October. So when my phone buzzed and I saw Mom on the screen, I actually smiled. I thought she wanted to talk flowers or ask if Aunt Carol's dietary restrictions had been sorted out. I stepped into the little side room they use for alterations and answered with the kind of ease you only have right before your whole world tilts. "Hey, Mom." "Ruby, honey, I need you to move the wedding." I actually laughed. I thought it was one of her jokes, the kind she makes when she's trying to be funny and it lands wrong. But her voice didn't have any air in it. It was flat, decided, already finished with the conversation before it started. She told me Emily had just closed on her first house, that the housewarming party had been set for the exact same weekend as my wedding. That family couldn't split itself in 2 directions, and since my wedding could always be moved, but a housewarming only happens once the solution was obvious, to her anyway. I stood there holding the phone, feeling the dress pins press into my ribs, and for a second I genuinely could not find words. I reminded her gently at first that the date had been set for over a year, that people had booked flights, that the deposits were non-refundable, that this wasn't a dinner reservation, it was my wedding. She didn't hesitate. "You're the oldest, Ruby. You should understand." I want to explain something about that sentence because if you didn't grow up in a house like mine, it might not land the way it landed on me. "You're the oldest, you should understand," had been the answer to everything my whole life. It was the answer when Emily got the car for her 16th birthday and I got a bus pass. It was the answer when my scholarship banquet got skipped because Emily had a dance recital. It was the answer on the day I graduated from the military academy, the single proudest morning of my life, up to that point when my mother sat in a folding chair at a regional dance competition instead of in the stands, watching her daughter commission as an officer. I had absorbed all of that. I had swallowed every one of those moments and told myself that's just how families work. Somebody has to bend, and I was strong enough to be the one who bent. I told myself it wasn't about being loved less. It was about being needed more, being capable, being the one who didn't require managing. But standing in that fitting room in my wedding dress, something in my chest didn't bend. It cracked straight through. I hung up without raising my voice. I didn't cry, though Dana told me later my face had gone the color of the dress. I walked back out to the mirror and looked at myself for a long moment. The woman who'd led convoys through worse than this, who'd stayed calm under fire literally and figuratively for over a decade, and who had just been told one more time that her life was the flexible one. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the wedding invitation list glowing on the screen, 63 names, half of them family. I didn't do anything yet. I just sat there staring at my mother's name on that list and felt something shift into place that had been loose for 32 years. I want to be honest with you. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew I wasn't going to ask permission to feel what I was feeling, not this time. For the first time in my life, I let myself sit in the anger instead of talking myself out of it. And somewhere in that quiet kitchen at almost 1 a.m, I made a decision that would change everything, not just for my wedding, but for what was left of my relationship with the people who raised me. I didn't tell Ethan what happened until almost midnight. He'd been at the office late finishing up drawings for a client, and when he walked through the door and saw me still sitting at that kitchen table in the dark laptop glowing wedding list still open, he knew before I said a word. He didn't ask what was wrong right away. He just pulled out the chair next to me, sat down and waited. That's who Ethan is. He's an architect by trade, but he's a builder in every sense, patient with foundations, careful about what he puts weight on. He let the silence sit there until I was ready to fill it. When I finally told him what my mother said, I watched something change in his face. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more solid than anger. He didn't say my mother was wrong, even though he clearly thought so. He didn't tell me what to do. He just reached over, closed my laptop halfway, and said the sentence that ended up rewiring something in me. If you keep choosing people who never choose you, they'll never stop asking. I sat with that for a long time after he went to bed. I stayed at the table until nearly 3 a.m, running back through years of my life like I was reviewing an after-action report. Every birthday I'd quietly moved because it landed too close to Emily's. Every holiday I'd hosted, cooked for, cleaned up after, while somehow still being the one apologizing for taking up space. Every time I'd wired money home without being asked twice, the roof repair 2 winters ago, Dad's dental work the time I covered 3 months of Emily's rent after she quit a job on a whim and called it finding herself. Nobody had ever asked how I found the money. Nobody had ever asked if I was okay. It had just become the water we all swam in. Ruby handles it, Ruby always handles it. By sunrise, I wasn't crying anymore. I was calm in a way that scared me a little, the same calm I get right before a difficult mission briefing when the nerves burn off, and all that's left is clarity. I called the printer, first the small shop downtown that had been handling our invitations and programs. I asked them to pull the guest list. Then one by one I went through it and removed every single Henderson. My mother, my father, my sister, Aunt Carol, Uncle Pete, cousins I'd grown up with at every 4th of July cookout. Every name that shared blood with me came off that list before 8 a.m. I didn't do it out of spite, not really. I did it because I finally understood something. If my wedding wasn't important enough for them to protect, then it wasn't going to be a place where they got to show up and pretend otherwise. I sent one email. No shouting, no bullet-pointed grievances, no 12 years of receipts. Just one line sent to the whole family thread at once. Since my wedding isn't important enough to attend, you won't need to attend it. Then, I did something I had never done in my entire adult life. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked Emily's. I muted the family group chat and logged out of the social media accounts where I knew the fallout would start landing within hours. I wanted quiet. I wanted for once to not be reachable. Word got around my unit fast, the way it always does. Dana told a few people, and by that afternoon I had 3 separate friends from my company asking if there was anything they could help coordinate. Sergeant Alvarez, who'd already booked her flight from Germany, texted asking if she should still come. I told her yes. I told all of them yes. If my family wasn't going to show up for me, I was going to make sure the people who actually did wouldn't feel that absence for 1 second. There's a particular kind of peace that comes after you stop waiting for people to change. I felt it that whole day, moving through my apartment, doing ordinary things, laundry dishes, answering emails about seating charts that no longer needed my mother's opinion, and realizing my shoulders had dropped an inch. I hadn't known how much weight I'd been carrying until it was gone. Meanwhile, on the other side of that silence, I knew exactly what was happening even without checking my phone. I could picture it perfectly. My mother, indignant, telling anyone who'd listen that I was overreacting. Emily probably rolling her eyes, telling her friends, "She always comes around." That's the story they told themselves about me for 32 years, that I was dependable to the point of being predictable, that my boundaries were negotiable if you just waited long enough. They had no idea this time was different. They had no idea the woman who used to fold under a single guilt-laden phone call had spent over a decade learning how to hold a line under actual fire. And that skill doesn't disappear just because the enemy is your own mother. A week later, the canceled invitation arrived back at my parents' house in the mail, the one I'd had reprinted without their names sent as a formality more than anything, just so there was no ambiguity left. I imagined my mother opening that envelope on her front porch, seeing her own name missing from a list she'd been on her entire life. I didn't feel guilty. I felt for the first time in longer than I could remember like my own life belonged to me. The calls started within an hour of that invitation landing in her mailbox, and they didn't stop for days. I know because Dana kept checking my phone for me, screening for anything urgent, watching my mother's name light up the screen over and over like a siren that refused to run out of battery. I never picked up. I didn't need to hear it to know exactly what she'd say. My father tried a different approach. He's never been a man of many words, the kind of quiet you learn to read like weather where you can tell a storm's coming by, how still everything gets first. He sent one text, the only one I let myself read before I put my phone away again. Don't make this into a family war. I remember staring at that sentence for a long time. Don't make this into a war, as if I was the one who'd fired the first shot, as if uninviting the people who'd already uninvited me from a lifetime of being prioritized was somehow the aggressive act in this story. That's the thing about families like mine. The person who finally says enough is always cast as the villain no matter how many years the actual damage took to accumulate. Emily predictably took her grievance public. She posted something vague on Facebook, the kind of post designed to invite sympathy without naming names, though everyone who knew us understood exactly who she meant. Something about family being about sacrifice, about how some people only think about themselves. The comments filled up fast. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in with heart emojis and sending love messages aimed at her, not me. A few of my aunts private messaged me directly, gently suggesting I was being harsh, that Emily didn't mean any harm, that I should think about how this would look years from now. I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I didn't have things to say, believe me, I had a decade's worth of things to say, but because I'd learned something valuable during my years in uniform. You don't win an argument with people who've already decided who the villain is. You just let your actions speak clearly enough that eventually the truth catches up to the noise. Back on base life didn't stop for any of this. We were 3 weeks out from a training rotation, and my days were full of briefings, equipment checks, coordinating logistics for 24 soldiers who depended on me to have my head clear. I threw myself into the work the way I always had, using the structure of it like a spine to hold everything else upright. One afternoon, going over supply manifests with Staff Sergeant Torres. She looked up from her clipboard out of nowhere and asked, "Doesn't your family know what they're losing?" I laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh. It was more like air escaping something that had been held too tight for too long. "They don't think they're losing anything," I told her. "They think I'll come around. I always have." She didn't say anything else, just nodded slowly the way people do when they've clocked something true and decided not to push on it. That night, lying awake, I let myself really total up the years for the first time. Not in anger, just in honest accounting, the way you'd review a budget. The roof repair after the ice storm, $4,000 wired without hesitation. No one ever asked how I'd saved that fast on an officer's salary. My father's dental surgery covered quietly so my mother wouldn't have to worry Emily with money talk during her college years. The rent I covered for 3 straight months when Emily walked out on a job she called soul-crushing and needed time to find her footing. Nobody in that house had ever once asked if I was doing okay financially, emotionally, or otherwise. It had simply been assumed. Ruby handles it. Ruby always handles it. So I stopped. I logged into the account I used for the automatic transfer that had been quietly covering part of my parents' mortgage supplement for the last 2 years. Something I'd started after my father's hours got cut at the plant. Something I'd never once mentioned to anyone in the family, because I didn't do it for credit. I canceled it. No warning, no explanation, no dramatic announcement. I simply let the transfer stop the way you'd stop paying for a subscription you no longer used. I imagine it took them a few weeks to notice the way you don't notice a support beam until the house starts to creak. But I knew it was coming. I knew the quiet erosion of not having me in the background anymore was going to show up in 100 small ways they hadn't planned for. Still, from everything filtering back to me through cousins and old family friends, the general mood in that house remained the same. She'll come around, she always does. Give her a few weeks. Emily reportedly told a friend at brunch that I was being dramatic, that this was just Ruby's thing right now. They had no framework for a version of me that didn't bend. 32 years of evidence told them I always would. What none of them understood, what none of them could have understood, because I'd never let them see the toll it took, was that the woman who used to apologize for asking for anything had spent the last decade learning to hold her ground under conditions far worse than a family group chat. The wedding was 4 weeks away, and for the first time in my life I wasn't dreading what my family would think of the day. I simply wasn't thinking about them at all. The morning of my wedding, Savannah gave me the kind of light you only get in early October. Soft gold low across the marsh grass, the air finally cool enough to breathe without your lungs feeling coated in humidity. I woke up in the little bed and breakfast 2 blocks from the chapel, and for the first few seconds before my mind caught up with the date, I just lay there listening to Dana moving around in the next room, humming something off-key while she ironed a dress. There's a stillness that settles over you on the morning of the biggest day of your life, a kind of clarity that strips away everything unnecessary. I remember thinking lying there that I felt lighter than I had in years, not because my family wasn't coming, because for the first time their absence wasn't a wound, it was just a fact the way weather is a fact. Across town I later learned my family was getting ready too. My mother had picked out a dress weeks earlier, something in soft blue, the kind of color she always wore to events where she wanted to be noticed, without looking like she was trying. My father had ironed his one good suit. Emily had done her hair. They climbed into the car assuming the way you assume the sun will rise, that a Henderson family seat would be waiting for them. What they didn't know, what I hadn't told a single one of them because I no longer owed them the courtesy of advance warning, was that there was no QR code with their names on it, no confirmation in the system, no place cards. My wedding coordinator had a final list finalized 3 weeks earlier, and it simply didn't include the people who shared my last name. My mother called the chapel from the car. No answer, the staff were already inside preparing for the ceremony, phones silenced. So they drove anyway, the way you drive toward something you've never once imagined being denied. I wasn't there for what happened next, but Dana was standing near the entrance when they arrived, and she told me everything afterward, careful and quiet, like she was handing me something fragile. The ceremony had already begun. String quartet halfway through the processional. Guests seated. Candles lit down both sides of the aisle. And there at the door, a soft-spoken young coordinator in a black blazer, clipboard in hand, telling my mother as gently as such news can be told, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're not on today's guest list." Emily, from what I heard, didn't take it quietly. She raised her voice, said there had to be some mistake, that this was her sister's wedding, that families don't get turned away. My mother reportedly went very pale and very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before someone understands something they can't undo. My father, Dana said, didn't say anything at all. He just stood there on the church steps in his one good suit, staring through the glass doors at the aisle beyond, at the flowers, at the candlelight, at a version of his daughter's biggest day that he was not going to be part of. Inside, I had no idea any of this was happening. I was standing at the back of the chapel, my hand resting on the arm of a man who wasn't my father, Ethan's dad, Robert, a steady kind man who'd asked me weeks earlier, gently without pressure, if I'd want him to walk me down the aisle given everything going on. I'd said yes without hesitation. There was something healing about that walk, about being led forward by someone who had shown up for me consistently in ways small and large since the day I met his son. Through the tall windows near the entrance, unbeknownst to me at the time, my family stood outside watching. Dana told me later that my father's face changed in that moment, not anger, something heavier than anger. She said he looked like a man finally doing the math on a debt he hadn't realized he owed, watching another man walk his daughter down the aisle because he'd spent 32 years choosing silence over standing up for her. The doors were heavy oak, original to the building, over a century old. When the usher pulled them shut after the last guest had entered, the sound apparently echoed down the stone steps outside, final, unhurried, the kind of sound that doesn't invite negotiation. My family stood on those steps for a while, Dana said. Nobody spoke. Nobody suggested driving to the reception because on some level I think they finally understood there wouldn't be a reception for them to attend either. They got back into the car. My mother, according to my aunt, who heard about it secondhand, cried the entire ride home, though, whether it was grief or humiliation, or the first real flicker of understanding, I couldn't say, and I wasn't in a position to ask. Inside the chapel, none of that reached me. I said my vows, looking at Ethan, at his steady eyes, at the small, unshakable smile he'd worn since the moment I walked in. I felt the weight of the ring go onto my finger, and felt for the first time in longer than I could remember entirely present, not managing anyone's feelings, not scanning the room for who might be unhappy, not performing gratitude for people who'd never once performed love for me. When the doors of that chapel closed that afternoon, they closed on more than just a ceremony. They closed on 32 years of being the one who understood, the one who bent, the one who forgave first and asked questions never. Outside, my family stood in the quiet October light, finally on the other side of a door they'd always assumed would open for them. I didn't hear about the specifics of what happened outside that chapel until Dana filled me in weeks later, safely tucked away on my honeymoon, far enough removed that the details landed like something that had happened to someone else's family. But back in Savannah, life for the Hendersons kept moving, and not in the direction any of them expected. Emily's housewarming, the party that had started all of this, the party my mother had decided was worth sacrificing my wedding for, happened the following weekend. According to my aunt, who still felt obligated to keep me in some kind of informational loop, even after everything, it was a smaller gathering than planned. A handful of friends showed up. Nobody could stop talking about what had happened at the chapel. Emily had spent months planning a party meant to be the center of everyone's attention, and instead she spent the whole afternoon fielding questions about her sister's wedding, about why the family had been turned away at the door, about whether the rumors were true. The housewarming she'd fought so hard to protect ended up being remembered by exactly no one for the house. It was remembered for the door that didn't open. My father told me later, much later in a conversation I'll get to, that he sat in his recliner that whole week, barely speaking. He said something shifted in him, standing on those church steps. Something that had been dormant for 3 decades, finally waking up. He started remembering things out loud to my mother, according to what she eventually admitted to me. Remembering who had organized every Thanksgiving for the last 10 years, who drove 2 states over every Christmas to make sure their tree got put up before anyone else arrived, because Linda always said she just didn't have the energy that time of year. Who called the hospital, coordinated the nurses, and sat in the waiting room the night my father had his gallbladder removed while Emily was at a concert 2 hours away and didn't find out until the next morning. It's a strange thing realizing how much of a family's structure depends on one invisible person holding it together. Nobody notices the beam until the ceiling starts to sag. And it did sag. Within a month, the calls I heard about from other people painted a picture of a household quietly falling apart at the seams. My mother, my aunt said, had started snapping at Emily in ways she never had before. Small things, dishes left in the sink. Plans changed last minute, the kinds of things Emily had always gotten away with because she was the baby of the family. Except now, there was no Ruby smoothing things over in the background. No Ruby quietly picking up whatever got dropped. The dropped things just stayed on the floor. Emily, for her part, apparently started resenting the attention shift too. She'd spent her whole life comfortable being the center of gravity in that house, but she'd never had to be the only planet. Without me there, absorbing logistics and softening tension, she was suddenly expected to organize things herself, remember things herself, show up for things herself. From what I heard, she wasn't handling that particularly well. My mother, meanwhile, started doing something I don't think she'd done in years. She started questioning herself. My aunt told me carefully, like she wasn't sure she should be the one telling me, that Linda had said almost to herself at a family dinner that had gotten noticeably quieter without me there to fill it. Was I really that unfair to her? Nobody answered. Nobody in that room apparently wanted to be the one to say yes. I want to be honest about how I felt hearing all of this tucked away on a beach somewhere with my new husband phone mostly off the wedding ring still unfamiliar and warm on my finger. I didn't feel triumphant. I want people to understand that clearly, because revenge stories often get told like the villain's suffering is the whole point, like watching someone else's world crumble is supposed to feel like justice settling into place. It didn't feel like that. It felt like grief, honestly. Grief for the family I'd wanted them to be all along, the one that would have shown up without needing to be taught a lesson first. But underneath the grief, there was something else too. Something steadier. A kind of quiet relief that I no longer had to carry the weight of managing everyone's feelings, that I could sit on a beach in the Caribbean with my husband and simply exist without one part of my brain running a constant background calculation of who needed what from me and when. Ethan noticed the change before I did, actually. About a week into the honeymoon, he caught me laughing at something small, a joke he'd made about the hotel's terrible coffee, and he stopped and just looked at me for a second. "What?" I asked. He shook his head, smiling. "Nothing. I just haven't seen you laugh like that in a while, like nothing's pulling at you." He was right. Nothing was pulling at me. For the first time since I was maybe 8 years old, there was no invisible thread running from my chest back to that house in Savannah, tugging every time someone there needed rescuing from a consequence of their own making. We came home from the honeymoon to a stack of unread messages. I still hadn't opened an inbox full of names I wasn't ready to see yet. I let it sit for a few more days. I wasn't avoiding them out of anger anymore. I was simply for the first time prioritizing my own peace over their comfort. And it turned out that peace was something I could get used to. 3 weeks after we got home, my mother showed up at my apartment building. I found out because the front desk called up to say there was a woman in the lobby asking for me, refusing to leave, saying she was my mother and needed 5 minutes. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling something twist in my stomach that I hadn't expected, not fear, not even anger, just a strange heavy tiredness, like being asked to run 1 more mile after you'd already told your body the race was over. I told the front desk to let her know I wasn't available. I know how that sounds. I know there's a version of this story where I go downstairs, we hug, she apologizes through tears, and everything softens into something forgivable in a single afternoon. That's the version people want, I think, because it's tidy. But I wasn't ready to hand her that moment. Not yet. Maybe not ever, not entirely. Some doors don't reopen just because someone finally knocks on the right one. She left. I watched from my window as she walked back to her car, and I felt something in my chest ache in a way I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. Grief doesn't disappear just because you've made the right decision. It just changes shape. My father reached out differently. About a week after my mother's visit, a letter arrived in the mail, his handwriting on the envelope, the same handwriting from decades of birthday cards that always felt slightly formal, slightly held back the handwriting of a man who loved carefully rather than loudly. I sat with that letter unopened for 2 days before I finally read it. In it, he wrote something I hadn't expected. He admitted he'd always known your mother favored your sister. He said he'd told himself for years that it wasn't his place to interfere, that keeping the peace mattered more than keeping things fair. He wrote that standing outside that chapel had been the first time in his life he'd truly understood what his silence had cost. Not just me, but him too. The relationship he could have had with me if he'd ever once been willing to be uncomfortable on my behalf. He didn't ask me to forgive him in the letter. He just said he was sorry and that he understood if sorry wasn't enough this time. I read that letter 3 times. I still have it in a drawer in my office. I haven't decided yet what to do with the feelings it stirred up, but I keep it, which I suppose says something on its own. Emily called not long after that. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, maybe curiosity, maybe the small stubborn part of me that still wanted to believe people could change if given the exact right moment to do it in. Her voice was different than I remembered. Smaller. She wasn't performing for an audience the way she usually did, wasn't building toward some clever line for a future retelling. She just cried quietly, the kind of crying that isn't for show because there's no one else in the room to see it. "I didn't know you felt this way," she said over and over, like the repetition might make it truer. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't soften it early the way I always used to, rushing to make everyone comfortable before they'd even finished sitting in their own discomfort. When she was done, I said the only thing I had left to say, the thing that had been sitting in my chest for months, maybe years, waiting for the right moment to finally leave my mouth. That's exactly the problem. You never wanted to know. There was a long silence on the line after that. I didn't fill it. I let it sit there between us, heavy and honest, the way silences in that family had never been allowed to sit before, always rushed past, always smoothed over, always somebody's job to fix. Not this time. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I never yelled at any of them through this whole process. I never sent an angry message, never listed grievances in a group chat, never posted anything online explaining my side. I didn't need to. The distance itself did the explaining. Sometimes the quietest response is the one that lands hardest, because it doesn't give the other person anything to argue with. You can't fight silence. You can only sit inside it and finally hear yourself. Emily asked toward the end of the call if there was anything she could do. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that some things take longer to rebuild than they took to break, and that I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make the phone call end more comfortably for either of us. After we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time, Ethan's hand resting on my knee, not saying anything, just being there the way he always was. I thought about my father's letter in the drawer. I thought about my mother standing in my lobby, turning around, walking back to her car alone. I thought about Emily's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. None of it undid anything. None of it rewired 32 years in a single afternoon. But for the first time, I believed that at least some of them were finally starting to understand what it had actually cost to keep choosing everyone but me. A year passed, the way years do when you finally stop organizing your life around other people's expectations, quietly, steadily full of small good things that add up to something bigger than any single dramatic moment could. I made lieutenant colonel that spring. The promotion ceremony was small, mostly colleagues and close friends. Ethan standing in the front row in his good suit, beaming in that quiet, steady way of his. My family found out through Facebook the way distant acquaintances find out things. Now a photo posted by a friend from my unit, a caption congratulating me on the new rank. Nobody in my family called, nobody sent flowers. And for the first time, that absence didn't ache the way it used to. It just was what it was. Information passing through a channel that no longer ran directly between us. I want to say something honest here because I think it matters for anyone listening who's lived through something similar. The silence didn't stay painful forever. It just became quiet. There's a difference between those two things that I don't think I understood until I lived inside it long enough. That first Thanksgiving after the wedding I hosted at our new house, Ethan and I had closed on it that summer. A modest place with a wide porch and a kitchen big enough for the kind of gathering I'd always wanted, and never quite gotten to have on my own terms. I filled that table with people who had shown up for me consistently, not because blood obligated them to, but because they wanted to. Dana was there. Sergeant Alvarez flew in again this time for something joyful, instead of a wedding overshadowed by absence. Ethan's parents came early to help me cook, his mother teaching me her stuffing recipe while his father argued cheerfully with Ethan about football in the next room. The house was loud in the best possible way, laughter spilling out of the kitchen, someone's playlist running through old soul records, the smell of turkey and cinnamon filling every room. Across town, I later learned my mother sat down to a much quieter table. My aunt, who still occasionally passed along updates whether I asked for them or not, told me. The dinner that year was small, just my parents and Emily, who'd gone through a difficult divorce that spring, her marriage having buckled under pressures nobody in the family seemed able to name out loud. My aunt said the table felt heavy that day, full of things nobody wanted to say. My mother apparently looked at the empty chairs more than once. I think in a strange way that was the moment the truth finally settled all the way into place for them. Not the wedding, not the months of silence, not even Emily's tearful phone call. It was an ordinary Thanksgiving table, quieter than it should have been, that finally made clear what had actually been lost. It wasn't just me. It was everything I'd always been the one holding together without anyone noticing, the coordination, the traditions, the invisible architecture of a family that only functions when someone's willing to carry the weight of it. I didn't gloat over any of this when I heard about it. I felt something closer to sadness, the kind that doesn't sharpen into anger anymore, just settles into understanding. My father called me a few days after that Thanksgiving, his voice steadier than it had been in the letter, and we talked for almost an hour. Not about apologies this time, just about ordinary things. His garden, a book he'd been reading. The kind of conversation that doesn't try to fix everything in one sitting, but starts carefully to build something new instead. I don't know yet what my relationship with my mother will look like in 5 years. I don't know if Emily and I will ever be close the way sisters are supposed to be in the stories people tell. But I know I'm no longer the one responsible for making any of that happen on a timeline that isn't mine. What I learned through all of this is something I don't think you can learn anyway except the hard way. People will keep asking you to bend as long as you keep bending. It's not usually cruelty, not exactly. It's just comfort. The comfort of assuming the person who's always shown up will always show up without ever having to examine why, without ever having to say thank you. Love without respect can survive for a long time on inertia alone. But it isn't actually love holding it together. It's habit, and habits break the moment someone finally decides to stop feeding them. I didn't set out to teach my family a lesson. I want to be honest about that too. I only wanted for the first time in my life to choose myself without asking permission first. Everything after that, the empty chairs, the quiet apologies, the slow, uncertain rebuilding was simply what happens when a family finally has to reckon with what they took for granted for far too long. People always think you'll stay because you've always stayed. The hardest lesson my family ever learned was that love without respect doesn't last forever. I didn't make them feel abandoned. I simply stopped abandoning myself. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below. And tell me if you've ever had to choose yourself the way I did. We share stories like this every single day, real ones, about the families we come from and the boundaries that save us. So subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Let's keep going on this journey together.